Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore thoughts in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. Before we get going here, big shout out to the Patreon patrons, people who are supporting this podcast financially. You guys are awesome. I love you guys. If you've personally benefited from this podcast, please consider joining the Patreon and helping this train keep rolling here. Another way you can support this podcast is subscribing on YouTube. I think you have to hit a notification bell if you want to see it now because YouTube's always changing their stuff. But do that if you want to see more episodes. And then if you really, really love this podcast, you can go over to Apple Podcasts and leave me a 5-star review and a comment. That would be huge. Today's episode, I'm going to be having a conversation with Dr. Rocco Gennaro. We were talking off air about how our ancestors would be rolling in their graves, hearing how we pronounce our Italian last names. Mine's probably Setacasa or Setacase, but it's Setacase here. So they're rolling in their graves, but that's okay. We're going to keep rolling through it, through this conversation. I say conversation because it's not an interview. We're going to be talking, man. We're going to be figuring some stuff out. We're going to be going over his book, Consciousness, and it's in the Routledge New Problems of Philosophy. I love problems in philosophy, so I'm really excited. Enough out of me. Let's bring him right in. Dr. Gennaro, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I love the problems of philosophy. Maybe I'm sadistic, maybe I'm a weirdo, but I think that's where all the interesting stuff happens. So I was really excited to see this new problems of philosophy. There's old problems or just problems of philosophy in Routledge, but this new problem, and to see that you did a whole one on consciousness. Before we jump into consciousness and those kind of questions, just how'd you end up getting into consciousness, being someone who they'd reach out to write a book on the topic?
Routledge had this series. Routledge had that series, and they were the person who, I think it's Jose Bermudez, who edits the series. Maybe I had a conversation with him, and then it one thing led to another, and then they ended up asking me, and then I think I just sent a proposal. So
Yeah,
might have been. I think I might have also broached the topic with someone at Routledge at a conference. They have the book exhibits.
Oh, sure.
Conferences. This would go back probably like 5 years now.
Yeah.
And then one thing led to another, and worked out, and then it actually led to me also editing an anthology with Routledge too.
Yeah, I saw that one.
They have, yeah. And
I got to pick that up. Well, so how'd you even become someone who would be an expert in consciousness? Like how did you get interested in the topic itself?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had more of like an empirically oriented way of thinking about some of the philosophical issues. I love the metaphysics. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
It's just that when it comes to say even going back to undergrad days, I did major in philosophy. And minored in religion, but so there's a lot of it. It seemed like a lot of the biggest issues started to come back to questions of philosophy of mind, right? I mean, even some of the big questions about life after death, or immortality, or the possibility of it, at least.
Yeah.
Those
Free
sorts
will.
of questions, free will, even is related, comes up. So it seemed like. And then the mind-body problems. So as an undergraduate, I kind of flirted with a double major. Didn't really double major in psych, but I was always interested in the neuropsych. Now this goes back a long way, So we're talking about 80s, the 80s, and then I think I decided to go to grad school up at Syracuse, and it was not only some of the professors there, but it was also there were a lot of. So sort of a flurry of books, at that time on consciousness, Daniel Dennett and Owen Flanagan, Patricia Churchland's Neurophilosophy came out. So that just kind of solidified, and it was kind of exciting. And it's like, maybe thinking of some of these theories and some of these views in a more empirical way in terms of some of the neuroscience. And then as a grad student, I even took a neuropsychology graduate course as part of the philosophy program.
Yeah.
So, kind of snowballed and always been of interest of mine. It seems like a lot of things come back to it, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's I love it. It's probably my favorite sub-discipline in philosophy because of what you said. There's everything kind of comes to it, and you could be looking at epistemology, you could be talking about free will, you could be, ethics, whatever. But at the end of the day, you are the one doing it. You're this, and are you the one doing it? I guess all these kind of things. These consciousness questions keep coming back up. Um, what what is consciousness? Start with a simple question.
Well, I don't know if that's a simple question, but
Right.
well, part of the problem with a question like that is always that it's the term is so ambiguous,
Yeah.
right? I mean, it's pretty well understood to be ambiguous too.
Hmm.
So, when people define it, like what is it that we're talking about?
Hmm.
Like what is it we're trying to maybe even explain? That's where you have some agreement among philosophers that probably what we have in mind is it's sort of Thomas Nagel's famous phrase that what it's like to be something that's like to be a bat. That there's something it's like to experience something like a subjective first person perspective, that kind of thing.
Hmm.
That's what people, at least philosophers, typically have in mind. What is consciousness? It's a like an essentially first person um, experiential subjective component. Now, once you get beyond that, and people sort of have an idea, well, I know what you mean. We're that's what we have. We are conscious,
Hmm.
but how do you explain it? I mean, there are about 10 different distinctions that come up. I mean, in some areas, the one question that comes up maybe the most in recent years is um, what makes a mental state a conscious mental state? In other words, what's the difference between a mental state, say an unconscious one, which just about everybody today, believes that there are, right?
Right.
I mean, Descartes didn't, but
Yeah.
I'm saying. And we sometimes the question is put more in those terms. Now, some will choose to pursue a more direct neurophysiological explanation. But there are other, kinds of explanations, mentalistic, different types of explanations that are given, and we can get more into that in a bit. But
Yeah.
that's sometimes it's the distinction between what's sometimes called state consciousness,
Hmm.
uh, mental states, or conscious. So we sometimes say, right, the pain is conscious, or whatever the perception is conscious. Other times, though, there might be a bit of a different, even linguistically, a different. The dog is conscious, so you're talking about something like creature consciousness or something along those lines. That's at least one common distinction if we're talking about trying to explain it, and
Yeah.
which is not notoriously difficult in many ways, right?
Hmm.
But sometimes just getting at least a little bit of a handle on the question itself, right,
Yeah.
is half the battle. So that's it's the term consciousness itself, like as an abstract noun, right? I mean,
Mhm.
it's not really used a lot. I mean, in the literature, I mean,
Yeah. Right.
I mean, it's the title of my book, right? So I understand it's used. It's just that we usually end up with 10 subdivisions and sub
Yeah.
questions.
Access consciousness, or phenomenological or
Right,
phenomenal
that's another
consciousness.
one. Ned
Yeah.
Block's distinction, the state versus creature consciousness. David Rosenthal makes that distinction, a while ago, and people use it all the time,
Yeah.
and the connections between them. Of course, you're going to get some dispute, about a lot of these. Some people wonder. I mean, in a way, I kind of am too. Why what Ned Block calls, access consciousness. I mean, why are we even calling it consciousness? If
I feel the same way, and maybe it's because I read your book, but maybe you convinced me. But I would think I was already teetering that way, anyways. And I just, yeah, I don't know how even helpful that is. If Ned wants to come on, man, then I will. I'll talk to him about that too. But
I'm
yeah.
sure he has plenty of. I mean, I know he has plenty of arguments and reasons
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah.
It's just there is a tendency. There is a tendency sometimes, maybe even too much of a tendency. If you go too far
Hmm.
with distinctions, everybody feels like they've got to make their own.
Yeah.
Then there's that. But the problem there is always that then you run the risk of talking past each other. right? I mean,
Definitely.
talk about unconscious phenomenal states. I mean, qualitative state. There's some philosophers even we use experience. I mean, to me, it just seems like at some point we can reserve a couple of those terms for just the consciousness.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily say anything about whether you could reduce it or not reduce it. The
Mhm.
neurophysiology is just this terminology, some at least terminological choices that
Yeah.
need to be made. Yeah.
Well, so Nagel's "What It's Like" principle, I don't know if 1974 something like that. What it's like to be, is there something it's like to be a bat, or what is it like to be a bat? The "what it's likeness" principle has stuck. Is that just an accident of history, or is that a good marker to go with? That consciousness means there's something that it's like to be that thing.
No, I think it's stuck because people really did have a very intuitive sense of what he meant. It's like people immediately kind of recognized, whether we're talking about animals or ourselves,
Hmm.
that if we are going to attribute consciousness to either an organism, right, a
Yeah.
bat, a dog, or us, or to a particular mental state, that we understand it that way. It's a subjective perspective. Maybe 100 years ago, behaviorists and more recent versions of behaviorism, because there was a long period of time where even within psychology and even among some philosophers, it was consciousness was almost like a taboo thing. You can't measure it, you can't see it, you can't right. And there was a long period in psychology for sure, behaviorism and even amongst philosophers for a while. But I think the pendulum has certainly swung back the other way. The good
Mhm.
thing about at least the last 30, 40 years, which is also, as I mentioned earlier, kind of exciting, is you're getting a lot more interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary interest and understanding between philosophy, psychology, neuroscience, and but again, you always have to be careful and be aware that there could be different uses
Yeah.
of these terms, and we want to make sure that we're at least talking about the same thing.
Right. Well, so sticking with Nagel then, there's something that it's like to be a bat, or is there? It was his question, right? You talk about it in the book a little bit. Animal consciousness
Yeah,
is there something that it's like to be a bat? Are animals conscious?
yeah. I mean, I've published a few things on that. I think most animals are.
Hmm.
Uh, Bats, I think, are. They're mammals after all. Now, I think Nagel was smart to pick the animal that maybe we would probably not quibble with much, but at the same time experiences the world probably quite differently.
Right. Yeah. Echolocation. Yeah. It's so weird.
Right, to make his point, about even if we knew everything there was to know about bat brains and neurophysiology, there's still something we wouldn't know,
Hmm.
right? What it's like to be the bat. That is, from the bat's point of view, and so on. So it was a clever choice. I mean, but there's plenty of reason to think most animals are conscious. I mean, it's a matter of degree, probably. I think, but I think if you go by the combination of the behavioral evidence, neurophysiology, some of the things that animals can do, without again being careful not to anthropomorphize
Yeah.
and that sort of thing. I think most are. I mean, there comes a point where I become a bit skeptical, or I'm perfectly willing to say I have no idea.
Yeah.
Just because I'm not sure there's enough evidence there, right? I mean, worms, houseflies, I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
some insects, some really, I don't know, tiny fish or whatever it is. But, the more you look into some animals, even ones that are very primitive, what we think of as primitive, it's not just that sometimes they can do things that you're surprised, that they're able to,
Yeah.
but it becomes harder and harder to explain them, in like a pure mechanistic way without any kind of consciousness or thinking going on. But I am kind of skeptical about some, but not until you get maybe down to a pretty low level
Yeah, that always it's like there's always a Sorites paradox that pops up in every field, and it's like, well, where do you draw the line? It's like, dude, I don't know. Just bring the ant to me, I guess. Let's see. We could talk about that. But yeah,
Yeah, I
so
mean,
you would,
there's also I
yeah,
mean, even the crustaceans, and but then you look closer at some of the evidence, and you start to see, they are pretty good at doing some of these experiments and tests, um, and you look at the brain, ways that we can understand. I mean, if an area of our brain, is sort of lights up and seems to underlie some of our consciousness, even very primitive kinds of things, like feelings of pain or fear or something like that. And then an animal, kind of has that shared area, or at least
mhm,
relative to its own brain, even if their whole brain is a lot smaller or whatever. And they behave the same kinds of ways under those certain circumstances. It starts to become perfectly reasonable to me, to
yeah,
infer that they have those, they are capable of having those conscious states too. Now,
mhm,
most animals, probably no animals, can have some, conscious states. We do. I don't think any animals can think about the Big Bang, or
yeah,
even maybe their own long-term death, or you know,
right.
I mean, or do calculus, right? You don't find too many, cat philosophy clubs. Or
Yeah, I'm kind of worried about octopi though, or octopuses. I don't know how the plural is now. They keep changing on me, but they're pretty sharp. Who knows what's going on in their brains there?
yeah, I mean, it's true. I mean, now they can do some amazing things, but some seem to be just purely physical, right, for
Yeah,
survival, right?
right.
The color blends in and all of that. But then they're also able to do some amazing things. There's that video. I don't know if you've seen it, of the octopus uh, being able to get out of a jar.
Yeah, I've seen that. It's there's a bunch of them now. They keep stuffing these octopus in jars to film them.
Pretty wild, actually,
Yeah.
in some ways. I mean, we gotta, we don't want to overstate it, but
Hmm.
there are a lot of things like that. You look at the bees with the waggle dance and communication ability, and so even things like a communication ability, even if it's within the species, right? I'm
Yeah.
not talking about it. Of course, they can't talk to us, but that's not really the point, right?
Right.
So if they communicate with each other, whales do it, right? I mean, there's a point where it's a little bit difficult to resist the conclusion that there's some kind of thought behind that. I mean, and if the behavior is somewhat flexible depending on what you know is communicated. I mean, it seems like, but there's certainly lots of things, of course, that we can think we can do that they can't. There are, of course, sometimes things that they can do, of course, that we can't, like
Yeah.
dogs that the smell, like the ability to smell, and you have seeing eye dogs. I mean,
Yeah.
why would we have seeing eye dogs to help blind people if they're unconscious? I mean,
Right. Yeah, sharks. Yeah. Well, sharks are kind of weird, but they have, yeah, electromagnetism, and I think ducks use that too. They just see the world differently. Do
right?
so you would say that consciousness comes in degrees. So like would a oh, maybe you wouldn't, but I think you said it earlier. But like, is an ant less conscious, or is consciousness like a thing that, like an emergent prop? All these things are loaded, but does it come as a block that like you are conscious or you're not? It's on or off, or is it like, oh, there's some degree of consciousness?
I think if you have a conscious state, or you're a conscious creature, that is kind of on and off,
Okay.
right? But the degree, I think, comes more with the degree of sophistication,
Hmm.
you might say, or the degree of ability within each of those, right? So, if you're able to consciously think about something, then that's on or off. But we have a degree of conscious thinking that animals don't, let's say,
Yeah.
right? Or a monkey has a degree of conscious thinking that a bat probably doesn't, or those kinds of things. So I think those are a matter of degree. Some of it can depend on the concepts, that which is another whole huge area of research. But depending on the concepts, right, that
Yeah.
the animals are able to possess. That's no easy task, trying to figure that out sometimes. But But that's part of it, right? I mean, you don't want to attribute, to animals conscious, like a conscious perception of something, if there's no reason to think they have the concept of
Right.
something, right? I mean, and even if they're looking right at something, um, that doesn't mean that they're going to describe it or think of it exactly the way we would.
Mhm.
But the consciousness bit, in terms of whether it's a conscious visual perception, I mean, to me, that is on off. Or
Okay.
if an animal's conscious, it's conscious. I mean, it's not, we might use the expression to some degree, but it depends.
Right. So, in kind of carving up consciousness, there's I don't know if this is still a modern debate or not, but there's kind of this qualia kind of debate whether there's like a whether qualia, like you have one qualia experience, like a unity of phenomenal consciousness, or whether your conscious experience is made up of a bunch of qualia, but you have different qualia. Um, and can you help us out with like consciousness like one experience and it's one qualia together, or one quale that you can carve out and you can talk about eating a strawberry or something like that, or is it a bunch of them kind of mixed together that we kind of bundle together and that's our consciousness? Does that make sense?
Well, it makes sense. It's just, again, this is one of these areas that there's a lot of ambiguity, but many people have thought about it and made
Yeah.
distinctions. I mean, it sounds a little bit like what you're saying is, or what you're wondering about is this notion of the unity of consciousness,
Mhm.
right? And qualia generally is just this term philosophers use, the properties of conscious experience, or sometimes it's, I'm not even sure that that's as necessary as it is. It just sounds good.
It sounds
Um,
great. That's why I use.
it's just, but when you're talking about the little parts, or the combining, or the
Uh-huh.
binding, or the bundling, I mean, you got the unity of consciousness question that comes up again. Unfortunately, or fortunately, for in a way, there's about 10 different notions of unity of consciousness. But one of them is sounds a little bit like what you were saying, like we experience the world as a unified field of experience. Let's say in a visual perception, right?
Yeah.
But also, we don't just experience one sense at a time.
Mhm.
So even a visual experience can be complex. You're at a concert, you're seeing a lot of things, right? But you're also feeling things,
Mhm.
right? You're also hearing things, right? And, combining all of that, if you want to think of it. Now, we obviously don't go around combining that consciously. Somehow, our brains do it.
Yeah.
That is still one of the issues, right? I mean, it's called the binding problem, right? And not only in philosophy but neuroscience. How exactly is it that the different sensory areas of the brain, operating pretty much independently, in some ways at least, give rise to the first person unified experience that results?
Right.
Not an easy thing to explain. It's
We could just
something.
say it's the pineal gland again. Couldn't we just cram it
Yeah,
back into there?
or you could say it's the non-physical mind that's coordinating it up there. But that
Yeah.
doesn't. Again, you could go that route, but that doesn't really help very much,
Mm.
obviously. And I never understood that, and that's maybe one of the reasons why the more empirically oriented part of me was, even from when I was kind of young, I'm like, well, how does being non-physical help to explain anything? I mean, I
Yeah.
just don't get it. It's like people talk that way about materialisms and problems, and I acknowledge it. It's silly to pretend that even if you're a materialist, you have all the answers, right? But like, well, how does a non-physical simple substance like Plato or Descartes, or even some contemporary substance dualists believe, how does that explain anything? It's not even supposed to be any parts, right,
Right.
of those things. So, I just don't really understand that people go down that path. But it's
Mhm.
it's it's one way to sort of shift the question. But in terms of the brain, yeah, I mean, you've also got there's other kinds of unity of consciousness that sometimes also are included and discussed, right? There's a spatial unity, there's a temporal unity, those
Yeah.
kinds of things. There's a bunch of them, and some of them have become more understood and explored, at least, or more apparent in recent decades, because another area of interest of mine, because of the psychopathologies that are associated with them. So you've got these experiences that people have, where even with very well understood named disorders, that people who they can't experience the motion, let's say,
Yeah.
you got it's called a kinetopsia, it's called, right?
I've never
Where
heard of that before. They don't experience motion.
they don't experience motion, at least not the way we do, right? And
Wow.
there's a problem, not surprisingly, in the area of the visual cortex,
Sure.
motion area,
Yeah.
because there's different areas, one for color, one for motion, one for and the process, the different. Now that's a really weird one, but there's a lot of other really really strange ones, and of course, temporal unity, things like amnesia. You got neglect, hemispatial neglect, where someone who's not cortically blind, kind of ignores or doesn't pay attention to half the visual field, like the left half.
Yeah.
So when you see these breakdowns, you've got famous kind of cases of the split brain patients and
Hmm.
all those things. So when you start to see all these breakdowns, it gives people also reason to not only recognize what goes into having a regular, normal conscious experience, but it also shows, there's a lot going on behind the scenes, right, in order to result in a normal conscious experience. And it can break down in a lot of ways, and sometimes in a lot of very, very strange,
Yeah.
very strange ways.
Yeah. Well, okay. So this might be a stupid question, but this is why I need to have more people on like you. I don't see a whole ton, and maybe I'm just not up to date on self consciousness. Um, what do you make of? I always thought self conscious was a pretty big distinction between us and everyone else in nature. That we have, we can reflect. We're self conscious. What do you make of self consciousness? Is that being treated in the field? Does it need to be treated more? Is it something that rightly ought to be studied?
Oh yeah, definitely, and I think it has been to some extent,
Okay.
maybe a bit more than than you think, but it sometimes can be neglected for periods of time, or has been, for periods of time.
Mhm.
But I'm actually working on a paper now. There's a special issue of a journal coming up that is dedicated to it.
Oh, awesome.
Self consciousness. There have been some, and even some other special issues of journals and books on the nature of self awareness, and whether it's having to do with our mental states, or even the role of our bodies in self awareness. So there has been, and there have also been, even historically, there have been philosophers who've argued that consciousness kind of entails, in some way, self consciousness, some sort. Now, people will disagree about what the nature of that self awareness is. But even going back to Kant and and Sartre and others, you have the view that, and I agree with this view, that consciousness involves self consciousness. The difference is that the kind of self consciousness you describe, I would just, the way I would put it would be introspection, right? That kind of thing you're talking
Hmm.
about. You're really kind of focused, inner, consciously focused in. That I would construe as being a bit more of a sophisticated form of self consciousness. I don't
Okay.
know if it has to be that sophisticated. That's where you do get more into the matter of degree, like
Yeah.
we were talking about earlier. I think you do get that matter of degree. So you can be self aware to some extent, not to the greatest extent. Again,
Yeah.
depending on the concepts you have. I don't know that self awareness of a mental state or self awareness has to involve that kind of explicit introspection. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
It could be a little more, minimal than that,
Okay.
little and accompanying conscious states. And I've argued for that sort of thing, in a few places. But
Mhm.
I think, and that's also related to the issue of animals, right?
Right. I was just gonna, yeah, talk about a whale. But so, um, are you having self consciousness? Is it like nested inside of consciousness, or is it something that like kind of emerges up out, or because it seemed like you're saying, yeah, it's entailed by consciousness.
Yeah, I think it's nested in. It's, you could think of it that I might put it that way.
Okay.
Each conscious mental state has a kind of nested in component of self consciousness or self awareness. Now that self awareness itself might not be again itself be conscious in the sense that you're introspecting,
Uh-huh.
but it's still a kind of self awareness that's involved. So I mean, I would put it that way. Others may not, but
It sounds is that like Kant, every thought has the I think with it? Is that
it's
that's
close to it. The only thing about Kant, uh, he his way of putting it though would be weaker, right? I mean, as I understand it,
okay.
he said more something like the I think must be able to accompany each of my thought, mental states or something
Mhm.
along those lines. And that sounds more like uh, each one of my conscious states must be able to be thought about. Like
Not that it is, yeah.
not that it is. So it's kind of more of a potential thing. Whereas I would say something a little stronger than that. But he again may have something different in mind. If he may have in mind introspection or something more sophisticated. And Kant, for someone who didn't write a word about neurophysiology, there's a lot in what he's written that I found very valuable in terms of uh, recognizing how much was going on behind the scenes
Yeah.
in in order to produce consciousness. So even something like what we were talking about, the unity of consciousness or something. I mean, he kind of recognized something like that had to be going on. He called it
The transcendental
synthesis.
unity of
Yeah, yeah. He called
perception, yeah.
it this transcendental unity of apperception. It sounds
It's wild.
fancy.
It sounds great.
And I was like, "What in the world is that?" And
Right.
after a while, I was like, "Oh, I see what you mean." And then he starts talking about the synthesizing activity of mind. It's behind the scenes. But if you notice, all that kind of stuff would be unconscious,
Hmm.
right? You don't, you're not actively doing all that, right?
No,
You're
right.
walking down the street, you're having visual perceptions.
Yeah.
It's but Kant, in a non neurophysiological description, in a way, we have different faculties, we have different areas, we apply concepts, but all that kind of stuff is behind the scenes.
Hmm.
And of course, today, knowing more what we know about the brain, it just to me makes it even more interesting, right? To look at it from a Kantian view. I think the other reason I think that has to do with, I've defended the theory called the higher order thought theory of consciousness,
Hmm.
something a version of it at least. David Rosenthal's the best known defender of it, and he, that's a theory which not everyone agrees uh, should subscribe or does subscribe to a view that consciousness entails self-consciousness, depending how you define,
Right.
self-consciousness. But anybody who holds a view like that or similar to it is going to think, by definition, or that when you're in a conscious state, you have a higher order thought about it, about that state. And if you construe the higher order thought itself as some kind of self consciousness, then you're going to have that implication, right? That having any kind of conscious state entails self consciousness. It's a view that, I mean, some of us take it to be an intuitively plausible view. Well, which of your mental states now are conscious? The answer for the hot theorist would be, the ones I'm aware I'm in. I mean,
Yeah.
which ones are unconscious? The ones I'm not aware I'm in.
Right.
And
That seems really intuitive there.
so there's a kind of awareness now. How do you spell out that notion of awareness of the mental
Yeah.
state? That's where you get 20 different versions of higher order
Awareness.
theories, and you've got 50 acronyms, and it can drive you a little crazy too. There, right?
Well, what about so I go with you there. That makes sense. And for a self-conscious person, I totally get that. How about for like a bat though? Like a bat has this qualitative experience of echolocating a dragonfly. Um, but to me, it seems like yeah, it's probably not self-aware of that, but help me out. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would agree that it is not likely capable of introspection.
Okay.
So the way we described a more sophisticated kind of self consciousness, yeah, I don't think the bat can kind of reflect on, or consciously think to itself, I am going to go now, and that kind of thing,
Yeah, sure.
whatever that is, in bat language of thought or something. I don't know.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, just the sheer fact, at least according to the theory I defend, and something like it, just the sheer fact that if it is capable of having a conscious, even outer directed, regular perceptual state of any kind, echolocation, that involves at least an element of a kind of self-awareness, right? I mean, the bat, even the phrase itself, the bat knows what it's like to be in that state.
Yeah.
Now, and it doesn't mean that the bat is like self-consciously, doing epistemology or something.
Yeah.
That's not. It's not what he. That's not even what Nagel thought, right? It was just,
Yeah.
they're capable of having outer directed first order conscious states. Maybe it's going to be strange to us, especially in their case, right?
Sure.
But but there's still an element of a self awareness, I think, in those kinds of states. It's just that it's going to be a primitive kind. And
Okay.
in the case of a bat, or at least some more primitive animals, they're not going to be capable of having that, next level up of introspection, right?
Yeah.
Consciously thinking about its own conscious perception of, of whatever.
Yeah.
So that seems that's another reason I think you have that distinction is important.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm pretty sure Nagel talked about that in the paper as well. Don't think of what it would be like for you to be a bat. Think of what it's like for a bat to be a bat. And so it would be weird for us to think, oh well, I'm a bat and I don't have how could I have my self-awareness? Well, you're thinking of yourself as a bat, not what you would be if you were a bat.
Right, because that's that was part of his point.
Hmm.
In the end, I mean, his part of his point was it wouldn't be enough for us to sort of, I don't know, put on some kind of costume, start to dress like a bat, and then go through even today like a virtual reality program. Still, that's not what it's like to be the bat from the bat's point of view.
Hmm.
Right? That's what it
Yeah.
would be like to be a bat from our point of view. So, I mean, it might be helpful. It's good for the imagination. It gives you a more realistic sense. But obviously, they're not going to have that same experience. I mean, to me, it's that in a way, it's not even surprising. I mean, their brains are very different. So I
Yeah.
don't mean that, that doesn't surprise me. Now, Nagel sometimes made it sound as if that's a problem for materialism of some
Yeah,
kind,
like
or
it's like the knowledge argument, right? It's been kind of developed in that way.
right, and it's sort of in that similar ballpark. But I don't. He didn't really try to use it even initially as a. I mean, he wasn't. It's not like he was dualist about bats, right? I think you understand, right? I mean, it's
Yeah.
not. Therefore, bat. I don't know.
Bats have souls and yeah, sure.
Bats have souls, or or
Hmm.
not physical. That's not what he was doing. It was more to me. It's more, and I think it is kind of important to separate the epistemology from the metaphysics. There, right? I mean,
Sure.
maybe there's some things we don't know and can't know because of, like I say, animal brains being so different. But I don't know why that's necessarily a problem for materialism. Again, it depends how you define the term. If you're just saying, minds are physical, let's say, or brains, or find it some way to that. Does Nagel really disagree with that about a bat? He's not really. I mean,
Yeah.
not knowing, maybe there are inherent limits to what we can know about others, but that doesn't make their minds non-physical, or
Yeah.
our minds non-physical for that matter.
Right.
It's a knowledge argument, and something. It's sort of like that, but in his case, he never really meant it. I think a better way to put it is maybe to think of it like it maybe just reminds us of a limitation of at least a very, very strong definition of materialism might be false.
Yeah, I was thinking maybe like, and I don't know, I guess I don't know where you fall on that path or on the scale, but is it a problem for limited materialism?
That
'Cause you
it
have,
could be a problem for limited materialism if you think that you can't dispense with, even theoretically, dispense with mentalistic language
yeah,
and consciousness. Yeah, I mean, but obviously there are a lot of other problems with the limited materialism,
sure,
as well. So most, which probably maybe have more to do with why people, reject it. But it's uh, it's it's related to that, I suppose, right?
yeah,
But not being able to know something is still quite different than,
yeah,
or not knowing something, whether there exists something or there is something. And
yeah,
sometimes they're a little conflated. They can be conflated in some of the literature,
Yeah.
but important an important distinction.
Well, I've taken it as kind of bolstering the first person perspective, and it's weird to say that because I actually don't think bats are persons, but that subjective perspective that uh, has come under attack by the third person objective scientific perspective, which you yourself you really like. Um, and so I've always taken it that way more than dualism. That kind of like his view from nowhere. Sorry, this is a whole conversation on Nagel here, but he's kind of a giant in the literature. There's more to reality than objective reality, kind of thing. Like there's all these subjective perspectives that if we reduce away, we're actually missing a lot of reality.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I think that's overstated in some of the
Sure.
arguments. Right?
Yeah.
There are other times when I might be willing, like I said, to just say, yeah, well, maybe, but so what? You kind of expect it, even if material is true, right? I
Sure.
mean, so the explanatory gap, but then there are others that are, explanatory gap. There's, there are the knowledge argument, as you say,
Mhm.
Mary in the black and white room. Now, some people, of course, I have a bit of a problem with a lot of these hypothetical conceivability argument types
Yeah.
anyway, to be honest with you. But, there would be good to have a little more information when people putting forward all of these hypotheticals,
Well,
Mary.
I hope we don't make a real Mary. Dr. Gennaro, we don't trap someone in a room and paint her white.
Yeah, I might have a hard time getting IRB approval for.
Yeah, that's right.
Maybe we should try it. I don't know. We should do that kind of thing and see what they say. But I mean, it's there are some questions that probably a lot of people think. Well, I mean, what doesn't Mary see her own veins a little bit? I mean, what do you mean she only sees black and white? I don't know. Even just things like that, right? They just
Yeah.
seem
You give her contacts or something, maybe.
must be they got to do something more than
Yeah.
that. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, and then there are others who have other reasons. You're still, even if you're one of the materialist replies is, of course, to say, she's not really coming to know something new. She's coming to know the same thing in a different
Different
way.
perspective or something.
And
Yeah.
so we're talking about the world, right, and the properties in the world, and so on. Then why can't it just be the same properties? Just you understand it either from the third or the first. That doesn't again lend itself to some sort of dualist view. I mean, even Frank Jackson himself, right, doesn't
Yeah.
no
Kind of
longer
reject,
thinks, yeah,
walk
yeah,
that back. Yeah.
yeah, no longer thinks it's like an argument for epiphenomenalism or whatever. So, it's important to keep those things, straight. But then there are others who are, again, even just the way that the original hypothetical is framed is, questionable, right? I mean, it does make you wonder if such a thing is feasible or how that would work in practice, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to do this. I love the conceivability. I just love like the armchair philosophy is my favorite. And I know that's terrible, but um,
Okay,
think things like inverted qualia or inverted spectrum or spectra. That one gets me going because every little kid thinks about that, and we're like, you pull out a bag of Skittles, and you're like, well, what if your purple is my yellow? And I love that one. It wasn't until later I learned that people have been proposing that. I don't know, just against materialism or physicalism, but against like functionalism.
right.
Um,
Yeah,
can you lay that one out for us and then kind of give us like a hey like why would that be a problem for functionalism and then what do you make of that argument?
well, I mean, if all the inputs and the outputs are the same, right? Let's say
Hmm.
the whatever it is out there that's causing you to have certain color experiences, or two people say, right? Um, and there's something different going on in terms of the experience, right? One's experience yellow, the other's experience red. Then it looks like the functionalism, as a theory of mind, right, so to speak, it can't be quite right. It's not just a matter of inputs and outputs; it's the feeling or it's the experience. Because you could have all of the, theoretically, at least,
Yeah.
hypothetically, you could have all of the same inputs and outputs and not have the feeling. People would say the same about pain, or right. I mean, now the inverted spectrum or absent qualia arguments. I mean, again, maybe it's not that simple. Um, it may be that if you asked a bunch of questions, a person, right, that you could tell whether they are experiencing. So, depending what the inversion is.
Yeah, it'd have to be like systematic. If it was systematic inversion or something.
But, you could ask, you say, well, when you look at the sun, is it bright? I mean, instead of, right, if you're talking about
Oh yeah,
yellow,
it could be
something
like negative. Yeah.
darker inversion. I mean, you shouldn't be looking at the sun anyway. I hope it's
Another one that's hard to test. Yeah.
or is it? I mean, we use these other words, right? That sometimes philosophers bring up that might be able to help answer whether or not your experience that we could never know is supposed to be the point. Maybe we could, but that's not that clear. It also could be that just the way our brains are in neurophysiology, the way the rods, the cones work, and everything else. It may also just be that at least some inversions are just at least physiologically not possible, right?
Yeah. Right.
You can always still say theoretically or hypothetically it is and go from there, but I'm not sure that that's going to carry as much weight in those cases. It could depend. So yeah, that's more of an argument against functionalism and not as much maybe materialism, but there are other problems materialism bring up which at least might be related, like the so-called hard problem and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so people bring up things like that. It's I do think sometimes people forget that we are somewhat in the infancy of neurophysiology and people it's almost like there seem to be some that are materialism, there's the hard problem, and I guess we're going to have to go somewhere else. It's a hard problem, and so what are you going to give up? Or
Yeah, that's an interesting take.
Just the way people put it. I mean, Daniel Dennett has that. Daniel Dennett mentioned one time, dualism is like giving up or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I kind of feel like that. Really, you gave it 50 years, and so now you
jump ship. Yeah.
Well, how much more do you want to know? What more? Now, of course, some argue that these problems materialism face could never be solved. Right. That's why you get these hypothetical, far into the future. Mary.
Yeah, because like a conceptual impossibility or something like that, right?
Right.
Yeah, that's what the argument. Well, I wanted to get your thought again on robots and robots' consciousness. To me, they seem like just an instantiation of a philosophical zombie. I think that I know we probably shouldn't talk about Searle. He's kind of like he who should not be named anymore, and probably for good reason. But the Chinese room arguments got in deep in my head. Do you think the Chinese room is successful against like strong AI and conscious robots, or not quite?
I don't think that argument itself is definitive as a problem for strong AI for a variety of reasons. I mean, I think the question that really matters more, even in his own original paper toward the end, is whether or not consciousness requires biological. You have to be a biological organism. People seem to forget that latter part of the paper where he seems more interested, and maybe rightly so, in whether or not consciousness has to be biological. I'm not sure how you could prove that.
I know. That's why I think we leave it off, because it's like, all right, you go figure that one out, man, because that one's weird.
Now, that's one of those things where why would you think it has to be? Why can't we? A part of it is, well, we don't exactly know yet quite what it is about our brains that allows for consciousness as such, right? It's talking about a physical. But I mean, whatever it is, if it requires something like, neurochemistry, I mean, then you couldn't have a conscious. Now, we still might say, well, why can't there be, again, aliens but they'd be biological. Maybe there's different biological. But the Chinese room argument itself, he never uses the term consciousness, right, in that argument. But when he talks about understanding, when he uses that phrase, that term, he clearly means, like conscious grasping.
Right. That's what I think. Yeah.
Meaning of the word. And it's very intuitive, and it's certainly has that initial pull, but it's puzzling. The most common reply, even back when he originally wrote the paper, was the one called the systems reply, right?
Okay.
Where well, maybe it wouldn't be. Maybe he's right that Searle in the room wouldn't understand,
but the whole room would, right?
The whole room would. Now that sounds really weird.
Sounds so weird.
But then it's, I mean, my response to that would be something like, well, you're the one that came up with the thought experiment. So, why is it weird? Also, and he says things like, Searle, in response to that, says things like, the idea that I wouldn't understand, but me and a bunch of papers and a bunch of other things combined with this or that and the other thing wouldn't understand, could understand, is absurd. Like, I don't know. I mean, that almost starts to sound like, the fallacy of composition, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Part doesn't, because a part doesn't understand, that means the whole can't, or the part. I mean,
Interesting.
does any individual neuron in my brain understand English? No.
Probably not. Yeah.
Point to each one, and the answer would be no. I said, well, I'll take the whole thing together, right?
Yeah. So
I understand English. Yeah. So
that might be an argument for the dualist might say, well, yeah, because you have an immaterial soul that's understanding. That's why, of course, Ned Block's Chinese nation. You can't.
Well, you could go that route, but then there'd be a whole other host.
I know.
That's what we're always better at the questions than the answers.
That's what's so good about philosophy of mind. You got, because I'm a dualist, I'm a Christian, so there's all this crazy stuff that comes with dualism, and you go, okay, and everyone throws the pineal gland at you. But then you go with the materialist, and there's tons of problems, and materialists are fighting against materialists, and that's what I love about it. Is it's just this wild, wild west, where I think a lot of philosophers of mind are really great at poking holes. Right. And then most people, when you pin them down, they end up saying something kind of strange. And that's so exciting to me. Right. I love that.
Well, I mean, it's in terms of religion, even growing up when I was young, I was raised in a religious household. But I mean, sure. Everybody at some point, you think about the problem of evil. I mean, we don't need to get into that, obviously. Sure. That was always one thing that I still have a hard time, we reconcile. But the other thing about it in terms of consciousness, though, was always this question of, well, people's brains get, like the brain damage argument, right?
Sure.
It's pretty well understood, even was well understood, even I think when I was 10, right?
Yeah.
That if damage to the brain results in consciousness deficits and all kinds of horrible problems. You have people progressively dying from progressive disease.
Yeah. We all got a grandma and grandpa. We see that as kids, and we see, it's terrible. Sure.
From trauma, concussions, all kinds of blindness. To me, if you take that to its logical conclusion, it's just hard for me to understand why someone would think, well, then when all of your brain activity ceases, why is it most reasonable to think, all of your conscious mental activity? Now, I'm not saying there aren't possible, maybe God does something, I don't know, maybe
sure.
God recreates your body someplace, I don't know, whatever.
Yeah.
And maybe, but it's a little, just always struck me as a real stretch,
mm-hmm.
to try to you first you acknowledge that all kinds of brain damage to sometimes very specific areas in the brain.
Yeah, right.
Eliminates certain conscious experiences, right?
Yeah.
Conscious language comprehension, all kinds of seeing, hearing. But then when all the brain activity ceases, you're a conscious being, and you're
Are you familiar? Maybe some of your students have brought this up, but like with Iron Man dualism, you ever heard anyone talk about that? It's a ghost in the shell. It's the same thing, right? But it's like Tony Stark. He's Iron Man when he's in his suit, but when his suit loses function, Iron Man loses that function. Like Tony Stark can't shoot a laser out of his hand when that's broken, and so when it comes to the mind. If this part of the mind, well, then your immaterial aspect can't function in this physical reality without that physical thing working. And so I wonder,
So that sounds closest to the response that's sometimes it's called the instrument theory. Like our brain is just an instrument through which, our non-physical minds, do things with our body. I mean, but, like I said, I have a real problem with that analogy. I mean, sometimes the analogy that had been used at least years ago was, it's like the television signals, or at least when we had them, it's the other way.
Right.
Television signals, but the TV set breaks down. You're not going to be able to watch the show, right? Yeah. But that's kind of, I think, a bad analogy, right? I mean, we're not the Alzheimer's patient, right? I mean, if the analogy is meant to really be an analogy. The television signal should be like the consciousness, right?
Yeah.
The brain is supposed to be like the television set that's breaking down. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, we wouldn't say to our grandmother there, don't worry, nothing's wrong with your consciousness, really.
Yeah.
It's your brain causing problems of communication or ability. It's your consciousness is fine. I mean, from her first person, it's not just that like we have a hard time, understanding, and she can't. It's presumably from her point of view, right?
Yeah. Right.
From
Yeah.
her
She's
point
like
of view,
bonded to that. Yeah.
she can't remember things, right? I mean,
Sure.
she can't understand some things she used to, and so I'm not sure what to make of it. Make of that kind of analogy,
Sure.
because it sounds like what's being said by analogy is, her non-physical conscious mind is just fine.
Yeah.
It's just that something in the, people use different analogies. Phone and like phone call where there's a signal problem or
Yeah. Yeah.
years ago. But even then,
But it doesn't seem like grandma's on the inside saying everything's fine. I'm just kind of glitching out because of my brain. Yeah.
if
Sure.
only people could understand, what I'm really.
Yeah.
Now, that could happen too,
Sure.
right? You
Sure.
could have someone in a, I don't know,
There's like a
persistent.
locked-in syndrome or something like that where that happens, but that doesn't seem like what's happening with grandma who has
It does.
progressive dementia or something. Sure.
Right. It
Yeah.
certainly does.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Gennaro, what do you think about robots being conscious? Like, can we plant your flag in the ground here? Like,
Yeah. Just to get back to that. I'm skeptical about whether robots, the way we understand them, being made of the materials that they're typically made of, could be conscious. I'm not sure I have a really great argument against that. It's hard to prove that kind of negative, like I mentioned earlier.
right.
To agree with Searle, at least to the extent that biology is required in some way or another.
Okay.
Consciousness. But I'm not, I'm not sure why. Sometimes he uses, of course, this vague phrase. Doesn't have the right causal powers. Nobody knows what that means.
Yeah.
He says, and I'm not sure I know what that means. I mean, in a way, I kind of think I do, but but I don't think even a materialist has to somehow automatically think, though, that any kind of material could be, even if it's manipulated, combined, could be conscious. I mean, why would we think that, right? I mean, there's lots of materials that, I mean, some materials just can't conduct electricity, for example.
Right.
They just can't, right? And you could rule that out forever, right? It seems like, but some can, right? So it may just be sort of like that, right? Some kinds of substances, obviously, they have to be arranged in a certain way, in a very complex way when it comes to consciousness, to be able to yield or result in consciousness. But I'm inclined to to think of it more, more that way. But yeah, I'm kind of skeptical that anything we consider a robot. That doesn't mean that. I mean, I love science fiction, and I watch. That's one of the other areas that got me interested in some philosophical questions growing up. I taught a class, an honors class last year, science fiction and philosophy, where you get into all just a lot of fun stuff.
That sounds fantastic.
Stuff, personal,
so good.
Consciousness, all that kind of good stuff.
Do you have Philip K. Dick on the list at all?
Yeah. We watched. We also did Minority Report.
And, great! He's the man. I love. Yeah.
And so Next Generation, there's Commander Data, and all. I mean, now that doesn't. I mean, there may come a point where they look so much like us and they act so much like us. I don't know, and that we almost start to not being able to help ourselves, but think that they, that they are.
But that wouldn't mean that they're like that. A behaviorist would say that they passed the Turing test, so they totally, they look like it, and we can't help but attribute it. But still, there's not anything that it would be like for data to be. There's nothing that it's like to be data.
Yeah, right. I mean, at least that's I mean, obviously, when you watch the show, you start to feel connected with, and you start to, and people are like, you start to feel sad for him. You treat him. Does he have rights? There was a whole episode, does he have rights? And these are all good questions. You've got the modern day robots now, very sophisticated, and some people get a little freaked out, to put it mildly, too, right? You got the whole iRobot fear scenario that's out there that
Totally.
I can understand that.
Me too. Yeah. People
You
always
know,
poo-poo that, but those movies, I mean, they were getting at something scary and interesting.
yeah, free will. I mean, whether it's consciousness or free will or both or whatever,
Yeah.
those are legitimate questions, I think. But but that, yeah, like you said, it wouldn't follow that automatically just because we can't help but treat them a certain way
Right.
as they are. But obviously, if we have any reason to think they could especially feel pains, for example, that that should be a moral consideration as well, right? Like,
Maybe don't make them to feel pain too, right? Like maybe we should get some philosophers in there overseeing or as
yeah.
they're developing this stuff.
Well, some philosophers. There's a few I'm not sure I would trust. Some might be okay.
Yeah, well, let's someone watching this, reach out to Dr. Gennaro here, and we'll see if we can get him in there.
There's a lot being done on along the lines of robot ethics,
Mhm.
which is interesting too. But even that's why I say consciousness. A lot of it sometimes can come back to consciousness. You got ethical questions. You've got intentions. Do the intentions matter? And
Yeah,
ethical, right? Judging whether something's right or wrong, like Kantian ethics, and so on. And so, in aesthetics, you have a conscious. What is an aesthetic experience?
yeah.
Consciousness is, plays a prominent role in that discussion. Kant and others, and so there always seems to be, almost always seems to be something that comes back to philosophy of mind or
That's
consciousness.
why it's so huge. Well, so in closing up here, you've been so generous with your time here, by the way. Um, I wonder about personhood. Is consciousness like a necessary or a sufficient condition for personhood?
Yeah, I think consciousness is necessary for personhood. There's the traditional list, at least includes, well, the Marianne Warren paper from years ago on abortion, but not just that. You can still disagree with her on abortion necessarily, but the traditional list, Daniel Dennett also uses something like this, which would be consciousness. Usually something like a self-awareness of some kind is included, ability to communicate, capacity for voluntary behavior or self-motivated activity is the way it's put sometimes.
Yeah,
Now, whether all four or five or whatever they are necessary, and although each of them are, is a different question.
yeah,
But consciousness does seem to be one, and especially in the context of ethical considerations.
yeah.
So yeah, I think it's at least a minimal one, but it is interesting. You do get some that will tie it to something like what we started with, the self awareness.
Yeah.
Then it not surprisingly, it raises those questions about animals that we discussed earlier, right? I mean, it sounds funny to say, a cat is a person, or, or an ape is a person,
Yeah.
but if again, depending on the criteria, depending on how you view some of them, it's a matter of degree or
Yeah.
whatever, right? You could probably make the case in some, which again could have and maybe should have some um, moral implications, right?
I think so, yeah, and that's why, again, just to keep talking up consciousness, those for those listening, if you're doing a degree in philosophy at all, consider doing consciousness, because it's like there's these two extremes of animal consciousness where like the Peter Singers and stuff will say, well, let them all out of the zoo because their consciousness is horrible, and then you have the other side, like Lex Friedman on YouTube, and saying that robots are conscious, and you want to say something in between without getting trapped in like a arbitrary, drawing a line saying, hey, look, a robot does not get human rights because they're not even conscious, dude, get out of here. But what's keeping us from saying that the ape has human rights? Well, it's not a human, well, it's conscious. And so I love it. It's so interesting, and I think there is actually a lot at stake, ethically speaking, when it comes to determining this stuff.
Right, and some people are also worried a little bit about even things like the future of war and droning and things like that.
Yeah.
Who's going to be making these decisions? How do we program robots? It's a little bit like the original iRobot,
Yeah.
Asimov three laws thing, but you do wonder, is it a way? Is it going to become a way of absolving ourselves of moral responsibility?
Right. Seriously, put it off on the AI and let them
That's right.
deal
Well, the
with it.
drone decided to, it
Yeah.
didn't. that we did our best in programming it, or that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. The
Hey, if we
culpability.
make mistakes, it's fine for. I mean, can't expect the drone to be perfect, right? I mean,
Right.
but I'm just saying that the one step removed seems so. But there are a lot of things like that. But if to the extent we are convinced, of course, that they're not conscious, especially current robots, let's say,
Mhm.
it certainly seems reasonable to use robots in certain kinds of situations, maybe even dangerous ones that might help us or prevent someone. You don't know if there's a bomb inside
Right.
of
Yeah.
their
Bomb
house.
disposal. Certainly. Yeah.
Yeah, you have these, and you could monitor. But I think when once they start looking more and more like us and walking more and talking more, where you got a lot more of that with the connectionist networks now, right?
Yeah.
It's sometimes it kind of freak you out. I mean, at
Well,
first I thought it
that's
was only
Terminator, and
people my age or something, but I'll
yeah.
show some of these video clips to the 20-year-olds in classes, and they're like, "Whoa, man!" They're like, they seem to find it even more creepy,
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I don't know if you're familiar with Philip K. Dick's essay or short story Second Variety, but it's
Not that one.
there are people living on the moon. He always puts people on the moon and then people on Earth, and the people on the moon have created AI robots, little scuttlers that run around. They've made autonomous warehouses underground, little scuttlers, but the autonomous warehouses are AI, and they're making their robots better. They make them into people, and they start destroying all the people on Earth, and then they find their way back to the moon too. So they're just destroying all humans, and it's every time I hear about autonomous weapons, I'm like, okay, well, Philip K. Dick talked about this back in the 70s. Here we go.
Yeah, I mean, you know how it is. Some things that started out as science fiction ended up. I mean, even laser as weapons, right? War
Yeah.
of the Worlds, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I mean, cloning. I mean, people don't often think of cloning or something like cloning, genetic manipulation. I mean, look at Jurassic Park. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously
Seriously.
you have the Island of Dr. Moreau, right? A famous, well-known book. So you have things like that people, aware of, made movies out of, and even if the reality at some point, 50, 100 years later, isn't quite like that, sometimes it's pretty amazing, actually. Even if you go back to the original Star Trek, some of the things, the communication devices, and
Yeah.
now there are some things that do seem physically impossible as far
Yeah.
as we know, but it is interesting to take a look at that, and it doesn't seem so far-fetched, compared to 50 years ago or
Yeah.
ago, right?
Well, so last question here. I'm glad you brought it back to Star Trek. Just a quick one. When they're beamed up, I never understood this until I read Kim's Philosophy of Mind book. But they're taking all their molecules and they're just uh, are they killing them each time? Every time someone's beamed up, are they being murdered?
Well, that's a very straightforward and blunt way to put it, but many people would say yes, because you're not really being transported in the sense that you take you and you're being moved, right,
Right. Right.
really fast someplace. What's being done is you're being scanned in a certain way, and then everything is being reproduced with the atoms and whatever is on the planet, right, that you're going down to, or vice versa. And so teletransportation, has long been an issue in philosophical circles. Consciousness research about, is personal identity, topic, as it sounds more like a case of simultaneous destruction,
Yeah.
murder, if you like, and the simultaneous creation of an exact molecular duplicate. Now, again, maybe a lot of people would, well, who cares? I don't know any different. Like, again, from the first person
Sure.
point of view, it's going to seem like, yeah, I was up there, now I'm here, so whatever, right? So you don't. But there are people who, maybe, I don't know. Would you get in one? I don't know. I mean, even if you could be sure it worked 100% of the time, not because you're afraid to, but just, I don't know. It does seem like you're being destroyed, killed, right? If you want to call it that, right? And yet reproduced simultaneously. And if that's the case, that's would seem like it really wouldn't be you. It would be some about as close as you can possibly get to you. You
Right.
know,
Right.
otherwise, but it's not. I mean, and it's interesting in that respect, right? And there was a famous episode of Star Trek where there were like two Commander Rikers or something like that.
Something. I think they did with Kirk maybe too. Kirk's like bad side got split or something.
Yeah, I think yeah they the one I'm thinking of is oh, they come up to a planet. There's some kind of distress call. They go down. The person is just like Commander Riker. It looks exactly like the guy, right? The
Uh-huh.
actor. And then they find then the other one who's been on board for the last bunch of years comes into there, and they're like looking at each other like what the hell's going on? And the one they brought on board from the planet was kind of a little bit upset, to put it mildly, because they thought he left them there for all those.
Oh wow.
And they, to make a long story short, they gave some reason why, there was a malfunction in the teletransporter where the signal was bounced off the ship, went back to he was recreated again on the planet, but
Yeah.
also was, so it's like one of those cases in personal identity, like what's sometimes called like fission,
Sure.
where one becomes, if you want to think of it like that, it again, assuming that it's still you at all, uh,
Right.
that one becomes two. And so each of them thought of themselves, though, right, of himself as the continuation of the previous one.
Yeah.
So it made for intriguing, not to mention very practical difficulties on the ship. Eventually, he's like, it was confusing for his girlfriend on board, I think.
Yeah.
So eventually, what did they do? I forgot what they did in that episode. Maybe they just, they sent them to another. I mean, one of
Yeah.
them was sent elsewhere, right? The one that was on a planet was sent elsewhere. It just wasn't practically feasible.
Right.
But
Right.
those kinds of things, theoretically can happen, and not just with teletransporters, but people use those kinds of, again, thought experiments in other ways. Why couldn't God just, destroy you and simultaneously make another one just like you, right?
Yeah.
Why not? If you could do one, why not two?
Right.
Three. I mean,
Davidson's Swamp Man kind of thing with the lightning bolt.
right, something like that,
Yeah.
or other kinds of examples. And is that which one is you? And you get into all these personal identity puzzles, which, I'm not sure. That's a case where there might not be any answers, in the sense that every answer has an air of paradox, about it. I mean, it's not maybe the terms that are just inherently vague, what we
Sure.
mean by identity or these kinds of things. And so, but they're very interesting. And even in a class on philosophy of mind or consciousness or whatever, personal identity issues, and comparing those questions with identity of other objects is always pretty central, like in a metaphysics class or topic or something like that. So
Yeah.
so it's pretty, it gets pretty wild, because it can start to sound really far fetched and bizarre, but part of it is, hey, you got to have a little fun with it, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. Well, your class on science fiction sounds awesome. I would love to have you back on. We could talk some science fiction and philosophy kind of stuff.
Sure.
I know the audience would love that. But for now, I would recommend this book. It's Consciousness, again, Dr. Rocco Gennaro, and it is in the Routledge series on new problems of philosophy. And this conversation has been super fun. Thanks for letting me jump all around and ask you different questions, and thanks for keeping up. And it's been great to talk with you.
No problem. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it too.
Awesome. Well, Lord willing, we can talk about this some more, but for now, it's going to have to do it. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.